Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I just want to say I hope that all are doing well. That was a beautiful video that we just saw. It actually just got me in the mood. So I hope that you are all in the mood for what I know will be an amazing and wonderful discussion today. So thank you for joining us today for this important conversation. My name is Uzo Dimaiwala, and I'm the CEO of the Africa Center here in Harlem, in New York City. And on behalf of the Africa Center team, I would love to welcome you here to our home in Harlem and to invite you to make this virtual space your home as well. Our mission at the Africa Center is to transform understanding about the continent, its people, and our role in the world. We serve as a hub for the exchange of ideas related to Africa and its people through collaborations with individuals and institutions, such as Interconnected Justice and City College's Colin Powell School for Civic Leadership, and the many organizations that help to bring this program to life today. I really want to thank Bishop Joseph Tolton and Dr. Sheridan Booker for their collective efforts in ensuring that we bring the issues we'll discuss here to the forefront of the agenda for the African and African American communities in New York, in Washington, D.C., across this country, and of course, across the world, all over the diaspora. Look, we know that the decisions that U.S. policymakers make towards the African continent, African people, and people of African descent greatly impact our lives and the lives of our loved ones around the world. We know that the African diaspora here in the United States continues to play a vital role in advocacy around Africa-specific policies. The U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa explicitly recognizes the vast richness of the African continent that continues to be underplayed, underdeveloped, or exploited in ways that fail to benefit African people and people of African descent. President Biden outlines how central Africa is to solving global challenges that will determine how successful we can be as a global society. And I just want to emphasize that for a second. The African continent has always been central to creating a better world. And I think it's really interesting now that the United States government is acknowledging that role that the continent has played and that African people have played. And it's really important for us as African people to really capitalize on that at this moment. The success of the Biden administration's effort will largely be determined by Africans' ability to reframe the way in which we see and the world sees us, our importance to our social, political, and economic future. At the Africa Center, we've always known about the importance of Africa and the African diaspora in determining the direction of the world. And we've not been shy in championing our continent as the solution to many of our problems, indeed the world's problems, rather than as a problem to be solved. We know that Africa is and has always been the home of incredible innovations. In my opinion, we're the originators of this entrepreneurial spirit. We know that African youth are filled to the brim with untapped potential. And we know that what's missing from Africa's advancement is not desire or will from its people, but rather the attention, the awareness, and the collective action internally and externally from people like us in this room and for all of you listening online. It's us, along with the people and communities we touch, who are responsible for ensuring that the ideas and intentions set out in President Biden's strategy are fully executed upon, and that we hold our elected officials accountable to seeing it all the way through. We all know that politics is not a sport for the weak, and we know that the changes we want to see never happen overnight or over a few years for that matter. But what we do know is that it's only through collective and concerted action that we can see any change at all. Incremental progress is always better than inaction. So I'm looking forward to the conversations we're going to have today and to the action steps that will come out from the ideas generated and shared amongst the community that we're building here today and the community that we hope to grow in the future. I want to thank you all for allowing us to be a platform for this work. And I want to thank Bishop Joseph Tolton and Interconnected Justice for partnering, for bringing us into this partnership. And so I'll turn it back over to Bishop Joseph Tolton to take us through the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so kindly, my dear brother Uzo. It is such a joy to be in partnership with you and our other strategic partners, the Congressional Black Caucus Institute, the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference, and of course, I am so grateful to be in partnership with the Colin Powell School of Civic and Global Leadership at City College, and to my co-presenter, Rura Arts, the president of whom is Dr. Sheridan Brooker. Thank you so much. How wonderful it is for us to be together from all corners of the Pan-African footprint. On behalf of Interconnected Justice, let me reiterate how grateful I am to City College for being so receptive to Interconnected Justice when we approached the school with the idea of a strategic collaboration, connecting the dots between the Biden administration's focus on Africa and the legacy of the first Black Secretary of State. Dean Andrew Rich is the Dean of the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. And with over 4,000 students, the school's mission is to transform one of the nation's most diverse student bodies into tomorrow's global leaders. Welcome, Dean Andrew Rich.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bishop Tolton. Thanks to everybody who organized today's important conversation. I'm really grateful for the chance to be one of the co-sponsors and to be involved in this, as is true for all of us at the Colin Powell School. As Bishop Tolton said, the Colin Powell School is the School of Social Sciences, and it's the School of Leadership Development at the City College of New York in Harlem. We have 4,000 students who are focused on developing themselves as leaders across sectors and in service to society. And we fulfill this mission in the service of an effort to shift power in our society in much the same ways I think that aligns with the conversations we're having today towards in our nation and in our city, students who come from backgrounds that have historically been denied power. 80% students of color, more than 2/3 forcing their families to go to college, half immigrants, mostly from the lower income communities of New York City. And when we succeed, we not only help our students to earn their degrees and find their footing in their education, but also to find positions of leadership in ways that transform how leaders think about the issues of the day. And it's a mission that came to us directly from General Colin Powell, who was our namesake, but also very much our leader until his passing last year. General Powell attended City College, graduated in 1958, grew up in the South Bronx, the son of Jamaican immigrants. He always said City College was his only choice, and it was the place where he found ROTC and kind of his purpose and his passion in life. And he returned to City College in 2004, 2005, as he finished his service to our country and devoted himself every day to the creation of the Colin Powell School and to its success for about 20 years until his passing. I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation, for the Colin Powell School to be a part of this conversation, because I think General Powell, during his time as Secretary Powell, the Secretary of State, took the African continent seriously in ways that his predecessors, in some sense, had not. And it's a source of some inspiration for what we're looking at with respect to the Biden administration's interventions and policy ideas for Africa at the moment. I'll just say a couple of things. I think General Powell or Secretary Powell is remembered in Africa for having engaged the continent, for having taken on the challenges and the opportunities more seriously than had been done before. He played an important role in peacemaking, in supporting the fight against AIDS on the continent, and in sounding the alarm against war abuses. Then Secretary Powell was the first U.S. official to declare genocide in the Sudanese region of Darfur, and was deeply involved in the peace agreement that ended Sudan's longest running civil war and paved the way for South Sudan's independence. It was under his leadership that the State Department opened a Sudan desk, and he was personally involved in the negotiation of peace there. In fact, across the continent, Secretary Powell was really a peacemaker. When he began as Secretary of State, there were conflicts going on in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Congo, in Angola, and in Sudan. And by the end of the Bush administration's first term in government, all of those civil wars had come to some sort of peace agreement, in many cases with Secretary Powell's active involvement. He played an important role in the establishment of the US President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which since 2003 has distributed more than $85 billion globally for HIV and AIDS assistance, with most of that distributed on the African continent. And so from a policy standpoint, Secretary Powell played an important role in engaging the continent and in prioritizing time spent in trying to address the challenges faced by the continent and in its relationships with the United States. And then I also think if you look back, you can see that it mattered that he was a Black American, that representation matters. As it does in this nation, it mattered abroad. Former Nigerian President Obasanjo told the Nigerian newspaper Punch that when he passed away, General Powell embodied Black culture across the Atlantic. He was not just an African American, he was an African American who understood Africa. That's something certainly that we try to imbue into the educational experience for our students at the Colin Powell School. It's part of what inspired American foreign policy going back now 20 years, but I think in some ways it's still reflected in the Biden administration's approach with their new policies towards Africa. And we look forward to the conversation again today. Thank you again for including the Colin Powell School in today's event, and we look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so kindly. Thank you so kindly, Dean Rich. I deeply appreciate your solidarity, and it's just been an absolute pleasure to work with you. It is also not lost on us that Secretary Powell eventually crossed political lines to support the candidacy of President Barack Obama, who of course inaugurated the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. And here now his former vice president as president of the United States is implementing the second U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. So certainly we are indebted to Secretary Powell for his work in Africa. Thank you again, Dean Rich, for being with us today. Speaking at the University of Pretoria on Monday, August the 8th, 2022, America's top diplomat unveiled the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. Our strategy is rooted in the recognition that sub-Saharan Africa is a major geopolitical force, one that shaped our past, is shaping our present, and will shape our future. It's a strategy that reflects the region's diversity, its power, and its influence, said Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Although the administration has not officially used this language, I often refer to Biden's U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa as an Africa pivot. It is the framing of the strategy, which is a clear shift in the United States' vision for what is possible between our country and African nations. But more importantly, it is the how this can be achieved that has never been articulated in these terms. There is a decisive evolution from a paternal relationship to a fraternal relationship between the United States and the African continent. The strategy clearly recognizes the power and the potential of Africa, as opposed to an approach informed by Africa as a great crisis and a great challenge. This is borne out by the strategy cleverly being linked to the AU Agenda 2063, which suggests that there is an intention to authentically partner with African nations. The pillars of the strategy are to foster openness and to promote open societies, certainly to promote democracy and to reinforce security across the continent, to advance pandemic recovery and associated economic opportunities, and then to support conservation, climate adaptation, and a just energy transition. Other highlights of the strategy are the stated intention to acknowledge Africa's agency globally, and also a commitment to de-emphasize Africa as a pawn in the war on terror. My fundamental critique of the strategy is that there is no budget associated with this new approach, and yet there are multiple priorities, but with no clear hierarchy. This raises several questions. Will the United States come forward with more quantifiable progress indicators and clear milestones? Will the Biden administration successfully manage the intergovernmental coordination necessary to implement the strategy? And then, of course, the looming question of, if the Democrats don't hold on to the presidency in 2024, what will come of this 5-year strategic plan. I look forward to robust conversation around these issues. However, the strategic intent of our engagement today is to center people of African descent globally as a united force, working hand in hand to advance our collective lived experience. This conversation is one stop on a journey toward establishing a Black internationalist consciousness among people of African descent all over the world. Over the last week, our people from everywhere launched the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent at the United Nations in Geneva. Is it possible that we are on the precipice of a new era of Pan-Africanism? From Harare to Haiti to Harlem, from Johannesburg to Jackson to Jamaica, we are indeed one people. As we move forward in this conversation, may the force of the ancestors be with us, and may Mother God watch over us. It is now my absolute pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists to join me in conversation. Akuna Cook is the founder and CEO of Next Narrative Africa, a media production company focused on telling African stories for impact. The launch of Next Narrative Africa was recently featured in the Africa Report. Ms. Cook previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in the Biden-Harris administration. Fumba Chamba is the Executive Director of the People's Action for Accountability and Good Governance. He's often referred to as Zambia's voice for the voiceless. He is known to be a relevant actor in the dispensation of democracy in his country. And he is also known professionally as Pilato, a very successful Zambian hip-hop recording artist. Dr. Zachariah Mampili is the Marx Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College, and is a member of the doctoral faculty in the Department of Political Science at the Graduate Center. He is also the co-founder of the program on African social research. Welcome, 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 my most esteemed colleagues. What a joy it is to be with you here today. And I want to say to our audience, our audiences that are viewing us on the YouTube channel of the Africa Center and the Facebook page of the Africa Center, also viewing us on the YouTube page of City College and on the Facebook page and YouTube page of Interconnected Justice. Welcome. We know that you are there and with us. We're excited that you're journeying with us. Please place your comments and questions in the chat, and we will do our best to acknowledge them. And also to my colleagues that are here with me in the Zoom room, certainly we look forward to your robust commentary in the chat. And I'm very much so looking forward to the specific engagement of our interconnected chapters in Africa and in Haiti and in Brazil. These young people are extremely excited to be with us in this conversation. They have been following the progress of the road to the U.S.-Africa Leader Summit, and I'm just super excited about how engaged they are around these issues. Let's jump right in and get your general reactions to the strategy. If I can start with Zachariah, you've written so beautifully about Africa's changing demographics and its impact on the political, social, and economic future of the continent. Zachariah, what are your kind of basic reactions and thoughts regarding this strategy?
Well, thank you so much, Bishop Tolton, for the invitation, and it's really an honor to be here. Thank you also, Dr. Booker, for organizing this, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be here and share a stage with Fumba and Akuna. So thank you all for joining us today. I want to jump in to sort of build off of some of the things that you said in your opening remarks about the nature of the U.S. strategy. And I think there's a very important document that was released in August 2022 that you are referring to here, which outlines the U.S. strategy to sub-Saharan Africa and identifies these 4 pillars of trade, security, democracy, and fighting climate change as the cornerstones, as it were, of U.S. policy towards Africa. And I think, as you correctly note, the document itself doesn't prioritize any one of these. They're sort of presented concurrently as sort of equal pillars of the US approach to the continent. But I am wary of this idea that all four can be pursued equally at the same time, right? I think that what we have to do is be more critical readers of the strategy documents and try to understand how it's actually being implemented and whether there is in fact actually more of a priority on certain of these pillars rather than kind of equal treatment of all four. And my assessment, and this is my opening comment here, so I'm happy to hear other thoughts, is that despite the desire to present all four of these pillars as equal, that ultimately the strategy is oriented around questions of security and trade, and that those are in fundamental conflict with some of the other priorities of democracy and climate change. What I'm suggesting here is that it's not possible to pursue our goals in terms of trade and security, at least in the current manner that we have done this, often by partnering with autocratic regimes in Africa, while also claiming to promote democracy and reducing climate change. And I think this is also borne out by the fact that thus far, there's only been two bills passed or put forth in the US Congress. One, HR 7311, is called the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act, which was passed by the House in April 22, with overwhelming support from both Democrats and Republicans, and clearly sets as its priority the idea that Africa is a battleground in a new Cold War with Russia and China. Similarly, if you look at the document that I was just referencing, Russia and China are mentioned 10 times in the document itself, I think revealing that our priorities in Africa very much are about our geopolitical interests rather than the interests of African states themselves. And similarly, the second act that was put forth in the US Congress is HR 6455, or the Prosper Africa Act, which again is solely about trade and expanding US economic opportunities in Africa. So thus far, there has been no action taken on these other two pillars of democracy promotion and climate change reduction. And I think, as a committed group of activists and scholars, we really need to make sure that the US is treating these as co-equal priorities, even if that means that we sometimes have to make compromises in terms of our security and trade objectives.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that critique. And we will certainly come back, and analysis will certainly come back to several of the points that you've made. Akuna Cook, as a biocontinental entrepreneur, how do you view the role of the strategy in your work? There's certainly a lot of attention to matters of trade, but I do know that one of the critiques is that there hasn't been a lot of focus with regard to the role of small businesses and perhaps entrepreneurial ventures as it relates to the strategy. Akuna, your thoughts?
First, Bishop Sultan, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you all today and to share my thoughts on the strategy, which I will do both as a former Biden-Harris administration official and fair to say, contributor to the strategy, but also now as an entrepreneur, and particularly in the entertainment and media space. I definitely appreciate the feedback that the strategy does not prioritize the numerous strategic objectives that have been outlined. And I think it's fair, as somebody who has been a strategist, to point out that without matching limited resources to priorities, you leave open what I would actually say is an opportunity for Africans to then identify what their priority is and communicate that to the United States. And so looking at the strategy and the numerous objectives that have been pointed out, I think it's an opportunity for Africans to say, well, this is what our top priority, and where limited resources in terms of senior leader time, financial resources, et cetera, should go. That does not excuse not having priorities laid out, but it does say that it is an invitation to our African partners to work with us in defining where the priorities should be. The other thing I would say about the strategy is to just give a little bit of context. When the administration started in 2021, it's not that far long ago, but you might all recall that we were in the midst of various global challenges. We were in the middle of a pandemic. In fact, I don't think I actually went into the office and met many people on my team for at least 6 months after we started. So we were facing the pandemic, but we were also coming out of a really serious democratic and civic society, civil society challenge here in the United States. 2020 was really difficult. It was a really difficult time in terms of a racial reckoning here in the United States. And the events of January 6th were particularly jarring for many of us around the world, and certainly as Africanists watching, because so many of our partnerships with the African people have been based on our shared commitment to democracy and the rule of law. So we had that. And then, of course, we're facing the economic challenges that were a result of the pandemic and that have extended onto the continent with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, et cetera, and of course, climate, which has been a challenge that has been with us and seems each year to be growing exponentially. And so it is because there were so many priorities, so many challenges, and a recognition that Africa would have to be a partner, a true partner with us, not a pawn, but a true partner in solving any of these challenges. And so the idea that it wasn't just going to be African solutions to African problems, but actually African solutions to some of these global problems, and that together we would need to basically be fighting on several fronts because of the multitude of challenges that we're facing. I think that's what some of the strategy is reflecting, that there are so many challenges that not only Africans are facing, but that the United States and the rest of the world are facing. So I know that is a very long-winded answer and does not even directly answer what you asked, which is how the strategy impacts small and medium-sized businesses. As you know, Bishop, I've recently started a media venture focused on telling African stories for global impact. And really the impetus behind this venture was to showcase Africans as having agency over their own stories, but also being able to use their stories and use their the cultural impact that they have had and influence that they've had around the world for generations, with and without credit, mostly without credit, to really be able to build the African economy. Right now, the entertainment industry is the second highest employer behind agriculture in Nigeria, which is the most populous country and on the continent, and has so much more potential to not only bridge the diaspora, which is increasingly demanding content, but also to change the images that people have in their minds about Africa and Africans. And that relates directly to what the strategy is trying to do, which is to say that Africans are going to be the architects of so many of these solutions that we need to face these problems. But we as consumers have not seen that in our media. We don't have that accurate portrayal in our media and in the stories that we consume. And so by attending to those images, attending to culture, you will then be able to open the door for a different kind of strategy.
Thank you so much, Akuna. Your analysis is so particularly interesting, of course, because of your background in government and now based on what you're doing in the private sector. Let's go to Zambia, to my dear brother Fumba Chamba. Your thoughts around the strategy. And at the end of your remarks, we're going to bring in our Interconnected Justice chapter from Rwanda and from Uganda. But Fumba, please first.
Thank you very much, Bishop. Thank you very much to the panelists. I'm happy to see Professor Zach after a long time. So first of all, I think we must understand that the strategy that we are discussing is a US document and not an African document. Therefore, even the interests that are projected in this strategy do not represent the interests of Africa. They represent the interests of America. It is America positioning itself as a big brother. It is America pursuing its interests, geopolitical interests in Africa. Therefore, as somebody who is in Zambia, first of all, there's nothing new because we've not participated as Africa. We've not participated in the development of that particular policy or strategy. Therefore, it's not our document. It's not our strategy. The question I would ask is, does Africa have a strategy on America, on how it engages America? I doubt we have a strategy on how Africa engages America. Therefore, our interests as a continent cannot be America's priority. Even when we speak of America not fixing a budget to this strategy, I do not expect that America should do that. If America could fund their own strategy in Africa, I think we need to remind ourselves of the psychological cost that comes with such a program, where a strategy on Africa, a strategy that presents itself as a treatment to Africa's problems and challenges and is financed by America or financed by this particular country on the problems facing a continent, the psychological cost is that I cannot stand on the same platform with an American and argue for my dignity when my own program of progress and advancement is funded and prescribed by their country. Therefore, I do think that this document is more of an American document pursuing their interests globally or in Africa than an African document. And by the way, Africa is dynamic. Africa, you go to one African country to another, you find a lot of differences. You find a lot of different challenges. You cannot therefore group an African reality or problem or challenge in one document, hoping that it encompasses or it responds to the dynamic challenges that we face as Africa. Therefore, it is my submission that the strategy may be a good document for America. I do not think that it's a good document for most African countries. Thank you.
My response to that is that 14% of the American population are African Americans. And I deeply believe that there should be an imprint of the collective reality and the aspirations for people of African descent globally that is seen on the U.S.-Africa policy toward sub-Saharan Africa. And that is why I believe that people of African descent living in the United States, be they African immigrants or African Americans, must come together as a united force to be a far more vocal and mobilized constituency base impacting the issue that you just brought up. But thank you so kindly for your insight and for your analysis. I'm going to go to ICJ Uganda, to Hazel Were. And I'm going to ask her to lift up her statement of concern and then have the panelists respond. Hazel, you're on mute. Please come off and speak to us. Hazel.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Uganda. My name is, can you hear me, Bishop? Can you hear me? Just
very well.
A mic check. Okay. I'm called Hazel Were. I'm the ICJ Ugandan ambassador. My concern was in Uganda, President Museveni has recently anointed his son to be successor of the seat in Uganda. And in Uganda, we are here that the supports democracy, but there's been no there's no public rebuke for this act that he did, and we're just wondering how can we trust that the U.S. is a friend to the youth movement, that we are working for freedom in our country?
Thank you kindly for that. That is definitely a key concern. Often it's been framed as Washington and the Dictators Club, where we rhetorically promote democracy, but then undermine our policies by strengthening the hand of dictators through military aid or other forms of cooperation. Zachariah, can I go to you to get a response to what Hazel has just lifted up as a concern?
Yeah, I think I'll speak here as a US citizen, and I am deeply embarrassed by our government's approach to Uganda in particular. I think, as you know all too well, there have been many attempts by young people and opposition figures in Uganda to hold the Ugandan government accountable, to actually live up to its promise to implement democracy in that country. But I think, sadly, and I think this is unlikely to change under the Biden administration, Uganda remains a close security partner of the United States. The Ugandan government has been a close ally of the United States in a key region that we think of as a key priority for US national security objectives, and that is the Horn of Africa, Somalia in particular. And as such, we rely very heavily on the Ugandan military to help us with our strategic objectives in that region. And thus far, this is, I think, the point I was trying to make, is that sometimes these values that we articulate, protecting our security interests and the security interests of other Africans, as well as promoting democracy, are in direct conflict with each other. And that's, I think, what we are seeing in the Ugandan case. And when forced to choose consistently, what we have observed in terms of the US government is that we will prioritize our security objectives over our concern for democracy, and probably similarly true for our economic objectives as well. And as such, I don't think, I was on a panel with Bobby Wine a few weeks ago, and he kept on pointing out the hypocrisy of this position. But I think that it's important to remember that foreign policy is often very hypocritical, and it's not likely to change US policy towards Uganda simply to point out that the policy is fundamentally hypocritical in terms of its contradictions between democracy promotion and pursuing national security objectives. I think a better strategy is to change the strategic calculus for the United States, right? As long as Museveni continues to, and his family, as you point out, continue to provide this very important security purpose for the US government, it's not enough that many Ugandans, young Ugandans in particular, are critical of the Museveni regime. That doesn't fundamentally shift the US prerogatives in terms of propping up the Museveni regime as a key security partner. And so I think there has to be a different strategy brought to bear. I think that the movements that some of you are starting to participate in are the future of the continent. And we in the United States in particular have a moral obligation, I think, to try to push our government to start taking seriously this idea that democracy is not just a tertiary or subsidiary priority for us, but a key central value that we must uphold by supporting young people and pro-democracy movements in particular.
Thank you so much for that. Akuna, in the creative industries, are Africans beginning to actually voice and echo the concern that Hazel lift up, as well as to some degree the concerns that Zachariah lift up? Are they using creative platforms to actually articulate that concern and perhaps even express their own thoughts on what a policy prescription could be to counter these issues?
Yeah, so I actually would say that I really appreciate Zachariah's comments because this is not an issue that is specific just to Africa. This is an issue for the United States around the world, whether we're looking in countries in the Middle East, in parts of Europe, across Asia. And it is because it is often really difficult to balance interests and to balance in any particular decision what's going to be, sort of what are you going to lift up and elevate? And so I recognize that challenge. And there are certainly times that I, as a citizen, have been disappointed with a direction that that the US government has gone in. But that is part of why, to your earlier comments, Bishop, that we as citizens have to be informed and engaged, in particular, those of us of African descent who care deeply about what's happening on the continent and who care deeply that the United States upholds all of its values, including to democracy and good governance. In terms of the creative industries, I think artists and creatives have long been voices for change. I had the privilege of working closely on Zambia's last election when I was still in government. And I know how important musicians and creatives and other creatives were in pushing for a more democratic outcome, and particularly from young musicians and young voices. And I think that, that is what is going to open the door for much more insights and conversations in this realm. Artists and musicians, writers, we are the ones who sort of observe what the world is like and take that outside for others to consume. And I, am really excited about the opportunity to create television and film that reflects these challenges as they are occurring, not just here in the United States, but across Africa, and show that young people do have their own ideas about how we can solve and contend with many of these issues, balancing democracy and good governance and openness with security and trade and investment. But really, overall, to your question, the answer is absolutely yes, but there is room for much more platforms to be created to give more young people and more artists and more individuals the room to express themselves without fear of government intervention stifling their voices.
Thank you so much. I want to move quickly in the interest of time to our Interconnected Justice chapter in Rwanda. Rwanda, can you all hear me? You are on mute, so please come off of mute. Can you just wave at us? We're so glad to see you in Rwanda. Can you all just wave at us if you can hear me there? There you go. So glad to see you. One of the important elements of the strategy is, of course, conversations around matters of global health. We have one of our ICJ members in Rwanda who's going to speak to that. Suleiman.
Thank you. I hope now you can just hear me.
Yes.
All right. So, yes, greetings from Rwanda. I'm Suleiman Muhirwa. I am a member of ICG Rwanda, and also, as he said, I'm a public health specialist. My concern and recommendation is that the US create a partnership between public universities in America and Africa to do joint research and development toward creating vaccines formula that can be shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suleiman. Does one of our panelists want to just give a quick response to that concern before we move to the next section of our panel?
If I understood the question correctly, it was whether the US can assist Africans in developing vaccines that can be shared.
Sure.
Well, I will just say that I spent a lot of the time that I was in government working on the U.S. response to COVID-19, and one of the outcomes of that was a recognition that we needed to enable and support Africa's ability to manufacture vaccines on the continent, not just COVID vaccines, but a number of other vaccines, including those that address neglected tropical diseases and a host of other diseases. And so I think one of, maybe I'll call it a silver lining of the pandemic, is that the world recognized that we did need to focus on enabling African innovation in the area of vaccine creation. And I know that and we set up in South Africa. There's a site in West Africa, I believe Senegal, at the Pasteur Institute, that the US was supporting vaccine manufacturing in those places. And so it is definitely a place, an area to continue pushing for further collaboration.
Thank you so much for that, Akuna. Thank you all for this incredibly important conversation in this first part of our panel. It's my pleasure now to present my co-host, Dr. Sheridan Booker. She is an experienced cultural strategist and management consultant who leverages her training as a social scientist in development, media, and philanthropy to help institutions and cultural change makers amplify their social impact. She currently teaches at City College of New York and is the director of the Beyond Identity Activist program. More importantly, she's a friend and colleague to me. Welcome, Dr. Sheridan Booker. And I also want to note that we are so pleased that Congressman Colin Allred is with us today. And so immediately following this conversation, we are going to introduce him. We're so pleased that he is here with us. Immediately after this conversation, we will bring our keynote speaker. Dr. Booker.
Thank you, Bishop. This is so wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here sharing this space with you all. I briefly just want to thank my colleagues at the City College of New York and especially Dean Rich for immediately agreeing to participate and co-sponsor this event when I reached out to him. Also, Deborah Chang and Nick Smith and Daniel Gila, who have been instrumental in helping us to organize two student respondents that are here with us today who will ask questions of the panelists. And my colleague, Dr. Nimi Gaurinathan, who is the founder of the Beyond Identity program that I work with at City College. We specifically focus on political education of young women of color so that they can participate in conversations like this. And, you know, it's my hope that some of our students will one day be involved in conversations and be doing the things that you're doing, Akuna Cook. So thank you so much. And to the other panelists as well, but I'm highlighting Akuna as a woman because I think it's important that women are involved in these conversations. Welcome, Fumba, and also Abdullah. And I believe Dr. Zachariah Mampili was also a part of this conversation as well. He has been rotated off, but we have some questions for him as well. Thank you. All right, and also thank you to Alana Francis Degovia and Nazareth Yamane at the African Center, who have also just jumped at this opportunity and realized how important this conversation is, wonderful partners in facilitating this event. So I would like in this portion of the panel to shift our conversation to speaking a little bit about what is the economic pipeline, right? I've heard a lot from colleagues who work in the Africa policy space. There was the meeting recently in Marrakesh that the Corporate Council on Africa hosted. And, people have said, we have these conversations, we have these convenings, but what is tangibly being done to change the reality of the relationship between Africa and other places in the world? And so without further ado, I'd like to bring it back to Akuna. As somebody who has an extensive policy background, you have been outspoken in shifting in this post-pandemic environment to talking about the necessity of narrative equity in stories told about Africa and the increasingly important role of the media and creative industry sectors as, quote, levers of influence and power. As the founder of Next Narratives Africa, can you share with us how you believe we can support African content producers and the booming media, film, and entertainment industries across the continent? What are some of the tangible ways that this policy, or not policy, but the agenda, and also African descendants and people within the diaspora, African immigrants, how can we support that pipeline from afar?
Thank you, Dr. Sheridan. It's a comprehensive question, and I will try to do my best to address as much of it as possible. I actually led the State Department's efforts to promote economic growth on the continent and covered trade and investment or a host of issues, including representing the State Department at the Corporate Council event in Marrakesh that you referenced. And what I would say as briefly as I can in terms of the economic opportunity is that we learned through the pandemic that what has been the US-Africa relationship in terms of trade and investment can no longer be going into the future. For example, we understood very clearly that the way that we have thought about supply chains, for example, the way that goods move around the world, very much excluded Africa to the detriment of the entire world. As supply chains were closing down in Asia and Europe, we suddenly recognized that the vast majority and potential on the continent have been ignored for so long. And so I think the first thing that needs to come out of the pandemic and the challenges that we faced over the last 2 years is expanding supply chains to Africa and doing it in an intentional way. Africans can not only have resources that have mostly always been extracted for value-added manufacturing and processing elsewhere, but it is now time for us to focus on Africa as the destination for value-added manufacturing, so that we're not just taking minerals and resources out of the ground and sending them to Asia and other parts of the world for further value added, so that we are only as a continent getting a fraction, in some cases 6% of the value of a product, but multiples of that can be done by starting to look at Africa as not just a place to take things from, take ideas from, take resources from for other consumption, but as a place that can actually be a hub of innovation. So I think those are some of the important points that I would make there, that there is an opportunity. I'll also say on the diaspora point, and I was reminded because Congressman Allred is on the line. In a previous life, I actually led an organization called the Black Economic Alliance that was focused on promoting work, wealth, and wages, so economic opportunity for Black Americans here in the United States. And that work was informed by my recognition, having done Africa policy, that the connection between the African diaspora globally and Africans on the continent was vital in terms of economic opportunity, both in terms of small businesses, but now to the question that you've asked about media. There is a significant opportunity happening because Africans are urbanizing. They're moving to cities, they're demanding more content. And at the same time, those of us that are descendants of African immigrants, whether our parents came here as students, as my parents did, or whether they were brought here forcibly, as many of our Black brothers and sisters here in the United States, or that there is this connection in terms of the content that we want to see, the way that we want to see ourselves as Black people represented on TV, the way that we want to see ourselves as Black women represented on TV with agency, that have complexities to our characters and see us as sources of innovation and progress. So those are things that if we first do it for ourselves, that there's not only demand for that from an economic point of view and from a job creation point of view, but from a psychic point of view, in terms of them being able to articulate and implement better policy going forward. So I think that these are all really interconnected issues between what's happening here in the United States among the Black communities and what's happening on the continent and in the Caribbean and in Europe and among the global Black diaspora, certainly in the creative industries, but really as we're pushing for a new economic paradigm post-pandemic.
Thank you so much, Akuna, for that thorough response. I'm going to turn the next question to piggyback off of everything you said. I really want to kick the ball to Abdul Karim Abdullah because he's working also in a similar space. As a preface to asking my question to you, Abdul, I want to flag that, the decline of AGOA imports in the United States recently are particularly due to the fall of oil imports, right? We used to import a lot of oil from Nigeria, Ghana, Angola, and Algeria. And I'm flagging this because Akuna has a relationship with Nigeria. And Abdul is logging in actually from Ghana, where he's about to kick off the Afrochella Festival. Right. And so for many years, there's been a lot of criticism around the way in which oil exports from Africa have created a monoculture in some African countries. And as the founder of Afrochella, an international music festival that took place the first time on the Accra Polo Grounds, where Kwame Nkrumah first publicly declared Ghana a free and independent nation, I assume that you and you have messaged this, right, in the marketing around the festival, that there is a clear connection between African sovereignty and the creative and entertainment sectors. You currently have a formal partnership with the Ghanaian government as the Ghana's Goodwill Ambassador of Tourism. So we'd like to hear a little bit about how this public-private partnership and the ways you see U.S. foreign policy can help support the development of this kind of service and entertainment industry, which is a clear shift, right, from the extractive industries that Akuna was referring to in her response. We're now seeing Africa produce festivals, produce cultural content, and other types of goods that would not be included in previous AGOA export imports, right? So what do you see as the possibilities in furthering develop this kind of industry and the public-private partnerships that are behind it?
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Booker, for having me here, and all of you distinguished panelists. It was such a pleasure to hear you guys speak and speak so forcefully and freely about your feelings and thoughts. And I agree with all of you. I think that it's very hard to kind of find a solution, but I think the conversation and the space for the conversation is such a great start. So thank you all for this event. I am a former CUNY student, so I'm very happy to to be on this call with you all. Afrochella is a cultural festival, and we started a festival that we felt that we needed to just build communication, a bridge, if you may, between the global Black diaspora and that on the continent. The whole world knows that everyone is looking to Africa. As you can see, an influx of several American companies, Chinese companies, Russian companies. We all know that Africa is going to be the youngest continent as of 2050. 1 in 4 people in the world will be African. So, we've never been short of talent around the continent. And as Fumba stated earlier, it's very dynamic across the continent. Right? What it looks like in Ghana may look completely different than what it looks like in Zambia and South Africa, and we recognize that. But for the most part, what happens is most of the world tends to think of Africa as one country, and we're not one country. So what our festival is really trying to do is build a bridge that can start to create experiences that explains to people the nuances that people may not be aware of. Around America, as nationalism continues to grow across the states, a lot of people are wearing dashikis. They're thinking about jollof rice. Everybody's dancing a Burna Boy now, right? We need to leave those opportunities to kind of figure out how to educate people. There was some time where there was conversations about cultural appropriation, but from my perspective and the philosophy of our festival, we think if you're Black, no matter where you're from, if you don't know where you're from in Africa, you're from Africa, you can pick a place that you can pick your place for yourself. And for that reason, we wanted to invite people back to Ghana. We wanted to welcome them back to Ghana. And what we started to see was the creative community was bringing people back, whether it was in fashion, whether it was in art, whether it was in beauty. And Ghana started to see that, right? When we initially began the festival, it was in 2017. The year of return was in 2019. And to that effect, Ghana didn't have a strategy around supporting the creative industry. But the year of return showed Ghana the tremendous amount of investment that they could receive in the country by inviting people from the diaspora. And in that year, I believe Ghana generated somewhat upwards of $3 billion in the fourth quarter of 2019. And since then, Ghana has launched the Beyond Return Initiative, which is to further the effort that we have been able to kind of build on, to kind of invite more people from the diaspora to come back and support the creative industries that exist. And our festival has continued to be that vehicle for more people to come to Ghana. For the past 6 years, we've been operating in Ghana. This year, we expanded our efforts to Cote d'Ivoire and South Africa because we understand that although there are many stories to tell in Ghana, we have to expand our horizons to do some of the things that Akuna is talking about by telling our stories. It's amazing that we have BET, MTV, and all of these things, but if you look at a typical African television show, most people are not seeing themselves on the TV. They're seeing American culture, European culture. And I think that there's an effort for us to change that by continuing to tell African narratives. The whole world knows about Bob Marley and his story. The whole world knows about Michael Jackson and his story. I think it's time they know about Fela, they know about Umu Sangari from Mali, and some of the amazing pioneers that have, Youssou N'Dour from Senegal. There's so many stories that need to be told across the continent that have yet to be told. And I think that that would, one, instill pride in young Africans, show them that there's something to aspire to outside of leaving America, leaving to America or Europe or Asia. You can do it right here on the continent. And really, as far as policy is concerned, it's really just kind of supporting the young creatives on the ground in their businesses. We recently did activation in South Africa, and I had the pleasure of visiting Makosa's factory. And I was very, very impressed to see a luxury brand to the caliber of a Louis Vuitton, a Gucci, right there in South Africa, that did everything from, having their own designers to printing, and had a zero footprint because they didn't waste anything, right? So even if the trimmings were re-yarned and used on a different material. And I thought that was very impressive to see, and we need to create policy or build policy that is going to support those efforts. The festival itself, we've done major partnerships with the likes of Twitter, Meta, Sony Music, Apple Music, and I think that maybe policy should involve incentivization of these companies supporting young creatives, not stealing from them or taking their IP and keeping it for themselves, but actually creating some incentives to ensure that these companies, when they come into the continent, that they understand they need to work with the young creators and ensure that they can keep their IP or at least have ownership of their IP. I think those are all fundamental steps to kind of ensuring that this kind of satisfies or develops and supports the young creators on the ground.
Thank you. Kumba, would you like to add something to this? I'd love to hear your perspective about what kinds of financial and human resources are needed to support this type of pipeline development. And as Abdul had mentioned, things are different in different African countries, so there might be some opportunities that you're seeing in Zambia that have not been mentioned yet.
So I think I would be hesitant to use the word support or help. I would want to propose a more collaborative approach to work, because I will tell you, Africa has so much to offer, and even what we imagine as solutions for Africa can be challenged by what actually is the solutions to our problems. I think if America was to be sincere, or the global community was to be sincere to finding solutions to Africa's economic challenges or even global economic challenges, I think the solutions are in collaborations. We have arts, creative products that we can share with the world. But while we have access to CNN every single day, 24 hours in our TV, Americans do not have access to our broadcasting channels. So whilst we can admire the American culture or American films, American music, and all of that, Americans do not have access to what we are able to produce. We can see we have access to the latest innovation in America. Americans do not have access to our latest innovations in Africa. So therefore, we are consistently pushed aback. And instead of us coming to a table to say, this is what we've got to offer, what are you offering in exchange? We are forced to present ourselves as asking for help. And I think in response to your question, I think a more effective solutions to the situation, to our problems, would be a more collaborative approach where Africans come to the table. What are you bringing to the table? You have the money. Yes, we have the creativity. We have the resources. We have the opportunity. We have the market. I think that's more sustainable and more appropriate to responding to the challenges that we face as creatives, but also as Africa in general. I think that also give us some level of dignity in spaces where we have to stand and compete with other people from other African countries or American countries or Americans. Unlike a situation where we are reminded that you're financed by us, we supported you, we helped you. It's a very huge psychological cost on Africans. And I think that should be addressed as we respond to the challenges that we face as a continent.
Thank you so much. That message of dignity is really important. I want to ask one more question, and thank you to all the panelists because this is phenomenal information and ideas you're sharing. I want to ask one more question to Dr. Mampili before moving on to have the student respondents from the Colin Powell School ask their questions. So for the past 4 decades, I woke up this morning, really realizing to myself that for the past 4 decades, we've been living under a neoliberal policy reign, right? That Thatcher and Reagan promoted heavily in the 80s. It obviously influenced the IMF and World Bank's structural readjustment programs in Africa, loan stipulations that have seriously impacted public services in African countries, including helped to close a number of public universities across the continent. And that's not spoken about enough, but that's a reality that our country and that the IMF and the World Bank have definitely been involved in doing. And that's the two-sided talk, right? But we are now witnessing what some might call like the gradual collapse of the North Atlantic economic and political power bloc. Or not the collapse, but the gradual decline, especially in light of growing domestic inequalities in the United States and in other places across Western Europe. You've spoken in your writing about the need for a structural shift in US foreign policy. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about what that means, especially in relationship to making amends for the paternalistic neoliberal policies of the past.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and you phrase it beautifully. I think it touches on something that both Fumba and Akuna mentioned in their commentary as well, which is that the U.S. has lost the economic war for Africa, right? We already know that the Asian countries are now the largest trading partner with Africa. Even more trade between Asia and Africa than there is with the EU or the United States, which historically have been the dominant trading partners for African countries. And that trajectory is not likely to be reversed anytime soon. And so, we have to ask ourselves, how did we arrive at the situation and what has it actually produced in the African context? And I think another word that you used that is hugely important for this dialogue is inequality, right? So what we know about this pattern of economic growth that has characterized African countries since the 1990s, because African economies have actually been growing steadily since the 1990s, is that almost all of that wealth has been captured by very narrow sets of political and economic elites in these countries, right? Africa is now home to 7 of the 10 most unequal countries in the world. And that includes wealthy countries like South Africa and Botswana, but also extremely poor countries like the Central African Republic. So these are broad and enduring trends that have really transformed the continent so that we can no longer speak about Africa as a homogenous place of poor people, right? We know, as some of these commentators have already made clear, that there are millionaires and even billionaires in many different African countries, while there is also just a growing number of people living in extreme poverty, right? And I think that, to me, is the ultimate failure of these neoliberal structural adjustment policies, is that even as they did produce some amount of modest economic growth, that growth has not trickled down in any equitable sense, so that we see, and I know Fumba can talk about this a lot in the Zambian context, is that the way that investment is working is not actually leading to people getting jobs in the formal sector, in the manufacturing sector, in the industrial sector. We have seen, that most of the investment that has come into African countries has been targeted towards mining, towards agriculture. That this has often been done by undercutting unions, so that working class people have been marginalized in these larger economic and political processes. And so I think it's clear that at this point, despite the success of certain sectors like entertainment, that the fundamental model of economic growth in Africa is failing. And I mean that if it's not serving the vast majority of Africans, then we can't describe it as anything less, right? We can't suggest that an economic policy in which a very narrow set of people is capturing all of the rewards is viable. So what does an alternative look like? And I think, I look at, things like the Fight Inequality Coalition based in South Africa. I know Fumba is a member of that organization. I look at a lot of different organizations, often led by artists. And let's be clear, not all artists have the same social justice agenda. Many artists in Africa are, pushing a very kind of capitalist mindset in their work. And then there are people like Fumba, people like Kurgi in Senegal and other artists who are actually participating in social movements, who are actively championing the interests of young people, of working class people in particular, and demanding that all of this tremendous wealth that we know Africa possesses not be used simply for the interests of foreign capital or for the narrow economic elite that pervades most African cities in the contemporary era. So we need a more equitable economic policies, right? And that's something that cannot only be done in the domestic context, but also requires the international community to stop supporting these sorts of activities that really view Africa fundamentally as simply a site for economic exploitation.
Right. Thank you so much. We need to wrap up because the congressman is waiting to speak, but I want to have Gilles Soulieu to ask his question. And I'm not sure if Aissatou Leye is still there, but Gilles, please go ahead. He's one of our Colin Powell fellows, an undergraduate student at the City College of New York.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in a room with such inspiring people. So my question is, senior White House officials have noted the summit will include new initiatives to increase U.S. engagement with the African continental free trade area. So are you of the opinion that African countries should be allowed to fend for themselves with each other's help, of course, or for the inclusion of third-party countries such as the U.S.?
I'll take that.
Yes, Sakuna, thank you.
I absolutely think that, one of the things that I'm most proud of the time was elevating the importance that the administration placed on supporting the AFCFTA, because by encouraging and promoting intra-African trade, so the ability of African countries to trade with each other, they will then also be able to take advantage of the 1.2 or 1.3 billion people strong market that is Africa, as opposed to having to continuously face outward, whether it be to the West or the Asia. They can look within Africa for markets, but also for resources and for goods and services, and that will necessarily increase the value that African consumers and also African businesses and investors are getting, as opposed to many of those benefits accruing outside of the continent. So I'm eagerly awaiting announcements next week, as many of you are, but I hope that there will be a significant announcement around support for the AFCFTA, because I do believe that will be transformational for the continent.
Thank you. Aissatou Leye, really, I'm so sorry to rush you like this, but we are on a limited time frame. Please ask your question.
Hi, everyone. So thank you to all the panelists for the brilliant interventions. I'm Aissatou Leye. I'm a Colin Powell Fellow, so at the City College Colin Powell School of Global and Civic Leadership. So my question will be, as you mentioned, the importance of soft diplomacy, of creative content, promoting the African continent. So what may be the role of social media? So we know we are at the era of social media, which often goes with misinformation. So how can you think we can use social media to promote a better image of Africa? Thank you.
And I'm going to cut it there because we do have to move to the congressman, but perhaps that can be answered in the chat or even after the forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very kindly, Dr. Booker, for skillfully facilitating this second panel. Akuna Cook, you're an absolute rock star. Thank you. Fumla Chamba, my brother in the struggle. So you have a double mantle, as we say in the church. There's a dual anointing on your life. Dr. Zakaria Mampili, please know that the ICJ ambassadors were very excited to meet you, as your writings in Foreign Policy Magazine have been texts for our intensive and for our study. Thank you. And to my dear brother, Abdullah Karim Abdullah, so inspired by the work that you do and so blessed by your presence today. Dr. Booker, thank you so very kindly. It is my pleasure now to introduce a conversation with our keynote speaker and our honored guest today, Congressman Colin Allred. This interview will be facilitated by Ms. Semhar Arya. Semhar Arya serves as the head of Diaspora Public Policy for Meta Africa and in the Middle East and Turkey for their policy team. She provides guidance on the company's policy priorities and opportunities for engagement.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Semhar Araya. I serve as the lead for Diaspora Public Policy for Meta's Africa, Middle East, and Turkey public policy teams. So in addition to the Meta staff and teams that are based on the continent, we are deeply invested in understanding and supporting diaspora voices on our platform and the ways that they shape policy outcomes, livelihoods, and make real impact utilizing our platform. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, but it's a huge honor to be here today. And I see that Bishop is back online, so I'd love to just see if your audio is back, sir.
Yes, my apologies with an unstable internet. I was in the middle, of course, of the introduction, but as a representative, Colin Allred is dedicated to helping North Texas families to gain the same opportunities that he had. His top priorities in Congress are working to lower healthcare costs, protect Medicare and Social Security, and creating an economy that works for everyone. Congressman Colin Allred serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and is on the subcommittee for the Middle East, North Africa, and for international terrorism. He is dedicated to expanding U.S.-Africa relationships and is committed to the unique role that the African diaspora should play in driving this opportunity. For your patience, we are most grateful. And may I also say, Congressman, you hit it out of the park on MSNBC yesterday. We were very, very proud of you. Congressman Colin Allred, thank you, my dear sister Semhar.
Congressman, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. And I want to thank you for your time. We have a very exciting conversation. So over the course, we've already been discussing the ways in which that the African diaspora can play a critical role in strengthening U.S.-Africa relations and supporting and collaborating with African colleagues and communities on the ground. So I'd like to kick it off with learning more about your experience as it relates to Africa, as it relates to supporting U.S.-Africa relations and diaspora communities. You recently were a part of a congressional delegation to attend Kenya's President William Ruto's inauguration. Tell us about that trip, why Africa is important to you, and how you've experienced it as a member of, the African diaspora in the broadest sense. And I should say, when it comes to the term diaspora, it is a process of self-identification, and everyone goes through their own journey. But as people of African descent globally, I think we all have a sense of some umbilical and some connection, and the journey is, of course, that discovery. So I'd invite you to share more about your trip and hearing from you about why Africa is so important. Congressman.
Sure. Well, thank you all for having me. It's been interesting to listen into the discussion. I am a proud member of the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus has a long history, I think, of trying to reorient the Congress towards being more interested in the U.S.-Africa relationship. And I'm proud to serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee with the first ever Black chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Greg Meeks from New York. And y'all are well represented by him, everybody who's up there in New York. And we also have incoming our first ever Black leader of the House Democrats in Hakeem Jeffries. Incidentally, another New Yorker. Now, I think most of the Black American experience is located in the South, where I'm from, but I'll just go ahead and give New York some props for that. My career before I came to Congress, I played in the NFL as a linebacker for the Tennessee Titans, and then I became a civil rights lawyer, did voting rights work, and I worked in President Barack Obama's administration. And so my focus on foreign policy has largely been around protecting democracy around the world, preventing democratic backsliding, and then also in domestic policy, unfortunately, has been so much around our own democratic backsliding and what we can do to try and reduce our levels of inequality. And those are both challenges for the United States and, of course, for multiple African nations and for the continent as a whole. So, I was really proud that with Chairman Meeks and President Biden's insistence, I was part of a presidential delegation for the inauguration of President Ruto. It was a I think a really remarkable experience because of Kenya's recent challenges in peaceful transfers of power, and that did not occur, with this transition. And if anybody has ever watched or attended, a Kenyan inauguration, it's a very literal handing over of the instruments of power at that inauguration. And to witness that, I thought was very powerful also because there were so many fellow world leaders and African heads of state at that inauguration who saw that, some of whom have not ever transferred power or, allowed their electoral terms to come to an end, let's say. And I thought that was really important for them to see that as well. And, we met with, a number of folks throughout Kenyan society while we were there. But particularly, it struck me at some of our meetings with some of the some young entrepreneurs who were asking about, foreign investment, access to credit, and a lot of their questions were things I get from Black business owners in Dallas, which is, how do we take this idea, into fulfillment? How do we get access to equitable credit? How are we going to be able to be, able to take our dream to reality? And, I was struck by the similarities and also struck by the conversation, particularly around what U.S. investors are looking for. And I think, this discussion around, kind of the economic future of and whether or not the United States has, played a productive role in Africa is a really important one. But I think it's still true that most African nations, most African, business leaders, most African entrepreneurs would prefer to partner with United States companies and the United States government itself over, say, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, or Russian investment, or some other, maybe entity. And so for us, it's important, to be available for that. But I also think that countries like Kenya, when they can show democratic stability, it makes it easier for that investment to come in. And that was one of the main points of discussion was, this electoral transition, relative stability is going to make it easier, for people like me to go to bat for investing funds, through our foreign affairs budgets to help economic development in Kenya, but also for public-private partnerships, for all the things that we need to be doing on the economic side. And, I think as I've been, evidenced here in this discussion, there is significant, domestic movements within Africa that we can support, that, I think we can be, really helpful in helping build kind of the civic society infrastructure with some of the lessons that we've learned as African Americans here. And, whether that's, our story of, overcoming, multiple hurdles, or, the kind of hard work of fighting against both de facto and de jure, discrimination. There's a lot that the African diaspora in the United States can contribute that we have, I think, not always fully had a chance to. And that's one of the things that, I know Chairman Meeks shares with me, and also I think a number of members like Barbara Lee and others, members of the Black Caucus, that we want to see us try and, help facilitate and maybe do a better job of being some of that connection there.
That's really great. And I think I really like how you've also highlighted the sort of economic areas of opportunity that are, interestingly enough, what we don't hear often is that these are being raised by small businesses, by entrepreneurs, people on the ground. I think that we don't have the chance to hear from them directly enough. So you sharing that is really helpful. I think you're also touching on some key themes that will be addressed in the coming days. As you know, today's convening is a precursor to the U.S.-Africa Summit, where economic growth, peace and security, climate change or climate justice, even the diaspora are now a part of this pillar, evidenced first in the national security strategy for the United States, but also in the discussions and the agenda for the week. One thing we're hearing very clearly from the messages around the summit is that Africa will be seen and treated and regarded as an equal partner, because they are, and that business and strengthening ties with Africa is a priority. What are some things that you expect to see this summit? What would you like to see as an outcome from this summit on the heels of your recent trip to Kenya and the points you've made? I think we're all very keen to see what this convening, the second of its kind, will bring out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic news. Just today, maybe hours ago, that I saw, President Biden announcing he's going to support the African Union becoming a permanent member of the G20. I think that's a really important, international kind of engagement and recognition, of the need to kind of elevate the African economic relationship past just one of, I guess you could say, exploitation into one of actual partnership. And I think that's going to give the African Union a really important seat at the biggest table in the world. And so I think that's important. I think we want to see increased investment in positive and long-lasting improvements in not only the physical infrastructure of so many African nations, but the kind of critical civil infrastructure. And that, I think, is something that, from the folks I know working on this in the State Department, Catherine Tai, actually the U.S. Trade Rep, led the delegation to Kenya, and she and I talked about this in the trade context. We want to reassess sort of our relationship with so many of our African partners, so that it's not so that we can be a better partner, and one what that is, I think, can help on both sides. For example, Kenya has long pushed for, in recent years, a trade agreement with the United States. And we have, I think, tried to reassess that, because what we don't want to do is just have market access to Kenya, and to where United States companies can come in and big agribusiness can take over all of Kenya's agribusiness, which we've seen in Latin America, for example, or where it's something that can be exploitative instead of helping grow Kenya's domestic economy, grow those small business folks that we're talking about, and put them on a sustainable path to be as flourishing as they can be. And so I actually think that this administration has a really refreshing outlook on how to do this. Obviously, not everything they're going to do and say is perfect, but I do think they're trying to look at this with a new set of eyes, not from kind of the long-standing approaches that we've had. And I think it's going to be important to hear, from forums like this and leaders, in the various African nations, of where we can be most helpful, because we are the best and I think most reliable partner for pick your African nation. We're not there to be a predatory lender the way the Chinese are. We're not there to exploit any kind of social or certainly military disruptions the way the Russians are. We actually want to develop strong, local, civically, locally, domestically, and civically run organizations and economies that can be open societies that are self-perpetuating, because for us, open societies are more likely to engage in a positive way with the United States. That's not just Africa, it's everywhere around the world. They're more likely to invite foreign investment when they have an open society in which people are allowed to flourish. And so that's in our interest. And so if you just want to be as cynical as possible and say, well, the United States is only interested in what's best for the United States, I actually disagree with that. But if that's your approach, it's actually in our interest to create sustainable movements economically and civically across the continent. So I think that's what we'll see them discuss. I think it's important that this is occurring, and I'm glad that, as I said, the president has already made one big announcement in terms of the G20 elevation. But we'll all have to wait and see more, and they'll have to follow up on it, because we have had important and seemingly positive pronouncements in the past from past administrations, and we haven't always had the follow-on. And it's a big world. There's a lot going on. We're all still recovering from the pandemic. We have an extremely destructive and disruptive war of aggression by Russia against the Ukrainians that is going to severely impact Africa in particular because of the food export situation. So there's a lot going on, and we have our own domestic challenges here in the United States that we are not entirely over. And my focus, honestly, in the last few years has been in trying to hold our institutions together. And so, I don't think we're coming at this from a perspective of arrogance. I think we're coming at it, at least I hope we can, humbly, and saying we want to work together for a better world.
Yeah, that's extremely insightful and important to hear from you. I think you've also touched on another aspect of the summit, your role in Congress, and for listeners here in the United States or in other parts of the world and on the continent, our brothers and sisters back home. We know that so much of your work also relies on engagement with your constituents. As a member of Congress, you're there to represent the people. And in your case, it is a district in Northern Texas, the 23rd district, which is highly representative of many members of the African diaspora, knowing that it's filled with African American, African immigrant, and just historically, as you alluded to earlier. That is oftentimes for the diaspora, I can speak on this just from my own experience, an area where we have a gap in maintaining consistent constituency engagement with members of Congress. And a lot of that is just in the challenges of building and maintaining sustainable entities in the United States. It looks different around the world, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the importance of a constituency for you and for getting these issues to the top of the agenda. As you noted, things will be announced, and it's really that follow-on, and in many cases, that consistent ongoing conversation. Tell us about how you represent your district, where you see the role of Black African diaspora constituencies.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question. We have North Texas, congressional districts are bizarre. They're drawn by all kinds of different things. So I kind of see it more as a region than just my specific district. But so the Dallas-Fort Worth area, for anybody who is, trying to imagine, where I represent, it's incredibly diverse in terms of, not just racial identity, but also in terms of nationality. And you have a huge, first generation, African population that's both Eastern Africa, Western Africa, Sub-Saharan. I mean, it's not, Northern Africa, certainly. And so it's across the continent. And, I think in a lot of ways, they're politically coming into their own in recent years, so many of these communities. And I'll say why. I think that there was maybe an assumption of kind of this continuation of American democracy and of kind of American institutions, forward progress, sort of an immigrant's attitude of putting your head down and starting a business and getting ahead economically, sending your kids to good schools. That's all incredibly important for our communities, but not as much politically engaged because maybe that's a little bit rock and go. I don't know how you want to say it, but I do think the Trump presidency changed a lot of that, both its approach to immigration, the discussion of how it talked about African countries, how it talked about developing countries around the world, and its challenges to American democracy itself. And I think post January 6th, we're all in a very different world in the United States. But for many of my constituents who left countries maybe that had political instability, who didn't imagine that they'd see that in the United States as well. And so I do think that it's a community that has politically become much more active, and I think that's a very positive thing for us, because I think that will also, to your question, lead to larger engagement in how we can be better partners with some of their home countries or with some of their maybe families or connections from the places that they immigrated from. And so I think that's really important. And what I've seen is that our efforts to help bolster civil society in Africa is, we can talk about the economic side as much as possible, and that's important. But bolstering civil society and using the diaspora to help with that, I think will have the economic outcome that we want when those civil societies are strengthened. And so, I've always thought that that's the best way for us to engage as a civil rights lawyer. That's right up my alley, is something that I believe in, identifying leaders and organizations that empower Africa's young people. Crucially, it's women that push for mechanisms of transparency, whether that's through journalism or activism, anything that's focused on accountability and equity. These are all struggles that we have in the United States, and we have learned lessons here that we can help, I think, around the world. And we can also learn from African activists and organizations on how they're doing it under sometimes much more dangerous or difficult circumstances. And then we can also be enriched, in return. So I think it's certainly true for me that every time, I've engaged on the Foreign Affairs Committee and anything Africa related, that we often can come to it thinking what we can provide to them. But I've consistently found that I've also learned a lot in return from that engagement, and I think that's true for anyone who actually does any work in this area from the United States. That we have a lot to learn ourselves, and that's why I really think we're all in a different world right now than we were just a few years ago, and I think there's a recognition of that in American policy, and certainly among members of Congress like me.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman, for your time. I'm struck by the points you've made around sort of the synchronicity of civil rights and challenges that we could all learn from each other across continents. And I also find that your points around economic opportunity being rooted in also social and civic support are also key. And we're very excited to see how the conversations and meetings can progress next week. And we thank you for your insights to help us look forward to conversations next week. Thank you so much, Representative Allred.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Allred. We know that we are at time with you, and thank you, Semhar. If you would just give us one moment, our young people around the continent of Africa, I think just want to give you a big shout out. The Interconnected Justice chapters in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Haiti, in the Congo. I also believe that we have our young people in Brazil. We're going to try to spotlight them. Uganda, can you just give some love to our congressman there? Pastor Simon, can you all just give a good wave to the congressman? I know that it's been really great. There you go, there you go, there you go. What about Haiti? And I believe that ICJ, there you go, the DRC Congo's there. They want to give you some love as well. And I believe that our ICJ chapter in Rwanda is about to come in as well. And they're going to give you some love as well. We just want you to know how much we appreciate you being here with us today and how much we look forward to journeying with you as we move forward as a body of Pan-Africanists standing in solidarity. We deeply appreciate your voice in the Congress. Thank you so very kindly.
Oh, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Okay, peace be with you. Thank you today. To our incredible audience that has been with us faithfully on Facebook platforms for the Africa Center, for Interconnected Justice and City College, on YouTube platforms for City College, and for the Africa Center as well. We are so deeply grateful for you hanging in there with us for now almost 2 hours for a program that was supposed to be 90 minutes. Lamont, if you could bring in Dr. Sheridan Booker, I would just love to have her here with me as we say goodbye and conclude. I want to thank her for her steadfastness in building this program with me. I could not have done this without her. Thank you to the Africa Center. Thank you so very, very, very kindly to the Congressional Black Caucus Institute, the Samuel D. Proctor Conference. Thank you all. This has been such an important conversation, and it is a conversation that will lead to action and to mobilizing a constituency base of people of African descent living in the United States and around the world to be a united advocacy force, really powering forward, I believe, a new renaissance of Pan-Africanism. I'm extremely excited about what the outcomes of this conversation are. It's not just us coming together to talk, but it is us coming together to talk that we might be inspired to take action. So please stay tuned. I'm sure that all of the organizations involved, Rural Arts, the Africa Center, Interconnected Justice, City College, the Colin Powell School, will certainly be reaching out to you with regard to their individual initiatives. And as we work together again collectively, we'll be reaching out to you as a collective. Also, Dr. Booker, do you want to say just a final word before we go?
I think you said everything. I don't want to hold people any longer. We really appreciate the outpour of support and participants in the event. This has been incredible. And I have to say, I didn't know it was going to be possible to get everybody on screen around the globe, but that is just a wonderful feeling to see everybody's face. And I want to thank the panelists for taking their time to share their expertise and experience with everyone, because these are important conversations, and we appreciate your time.
Awesome. So this is just an interconnected justice tradition where there's a little bit of a beautiful cacophonous Pan-African moment at the very end. I'm going to ask you to actually put your view on gallery so that you can actually experience everybody who's here. And I'm going to ask that all of those that can will come onto camera so that we can just spend a few minutes literally just sharing the love with each other between Uganda and Kenya and Brazil, which is in the house, and Haiti, and those of us here in the United States and in the Congo. Please turn on your cameras wherever you are and come off of mute. And for the next few moments, so good to see my dear friend from Adna, Imani Countess, and all of those that participated. I encourage you to just share love with each other across the waters, because we don't have this kind of an opportunity all the time. So please come off of mute and just share love with your brothers and sisters. Thank you so much for being with us as we say goodbye.
Blessings. Thank you all.
Blessings to everyone.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.